Hello, and welcome back to another video and live stream on this channel. Today, we're joined with my good friend Warren, who is joining us from Shenzhen today. And also, we're going to be talking all things Dostoevsky, Jordan B. Peterson, atheism, and all that cool stuff. So if you're interested, make sure to stay around, and you can ask us questions anytime in the chats and in the comments below. I've also pinned Warren's YouTube channel as well in the link. You can go and check it out after the stream. He started a new channel talking about crazy stuff like Kafka, Heidegger, and all those crazy stuff. So make sure you go share some love to him by hitting that subscribe button on his channel and help his channel grow as well. So Warren, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for the promotion.
Anytime, feel free to promote yourself whenever necessary. And then the next thing is just going to be you giving Ben Shapiro ads for the entire time. The Wi-Fi was glitching out for a bit.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Is it working
The
now?
laughter was glitching,
Okay.
and then you could just, and then your laughter was glitching itself. So it's like,
Okay. Let's start. Let's start with the
sure.
Heidegger quotation. Okay, Heidegger says, "Every thinker thinks only one thought." Here too, thinking differs essentially from science. The researcher needs constantly new discoveries and inspirations, else science will bog down and fall into error. The thinker needs one thought only, and for the thinker, the difficulty is to hold fast to this one only thought as the one and only thing that he must think. So my question would be, what do you think is Dostoevsky's one thought? Since Dostoevsky's like your favorite writer.
Well, I think Dostoevsky's perhaps his favorite thought or his main thought would undeniably be the thought of Christ, which I think he meditates on throughout his books, the idea of hope and beauty and love through Christ, which I think is his most important idea. And it's this idea of the human relationship with Christ, which I think is also very important. It's like, well, how does man live? And also, how can man live without Christ? And I think that those are the two fundamental questions that Dostoevsky has in mind when he's writing. And it's a similar theme in Nietzsche as well, I think. And it's the idea of, do you need Christ? And if Christ does not exist, what is the consequences? Is it nihilism? And that would be his main thoughts relating to Christ, I think.
Yeah, I was reading Hannah Arendt the other day, and Hannah Arendt also talked about Christ and also in relation to Socrates. So she talked about something like moral propositions cannot be proved. So what can only convince one of the truth of a moral proposition can only be examples. So either of Socrates who voluntarily gets executed or drinks the hemlock in Athens, so he does not betray justice, or Christ crucifying on a cross. So I think that's really profound.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree with that, because I think that there are times when you realize that logic and arguments and writing essays can only get you so far. I think there's a significant limit to man's ability to directly express himself via words. And that's why I think that most people, what they would get to or what reaches out to them is more the Bible story than an argument for the existence of God, or perhaps why Dostoevsky might be more attractive to someone than reading, I don't know, some essay on some ontological argument or something like that. And I think that the fundamental reason for that is perhaps because we, in an essay, in like an argument, the logical form, you can interact with it with your brain, but you can't interact with it with your soul. You cannot have a relationship with it. But then when you have like a story, a novel, or example, you could really live with it. You could feel the pain of the writer when the children in Dostoevsky's novels are starving, when they're being ripped apart by dogs, or when they're suffering from tuberculosis. Like you could emphasize, you can feel with those issues, and the problems are made stronger through these interactions. And I think that's definitely one of the greatest strengths of literature, and it really talks about the limits of our language, I think, as well.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. That's one of the better things about literature. And also I think related to this, there's also another really interesting Heidegger thought, which he says that when you're thinking, you're not necessarily thinking those thoughts but the thoughts come over to you, and somehow you have to remain open yourself to let the thoughts come over instead of actively pursuing the thoughts. So in Heidegger's view, these kind of, I guess, rational deduction, going from premise A to premise B and then deducing the logical conclusion wouldn't be called thinking. But this kind of letting an image or a metaphor or a symbol come over to you would be the best form of thinking.
Yes, I'll definitely agree with that. I think that a lot of times when we're thinking, we are very much in a passive seat, like recently I was writing a diary, but then I don't think I can necessarily call it a diary because it's more about me writing about me, analyzing myself to give advice for myself in a third person topic, in third person voice, talking about myself in the first person. And it's an absolutely very weird diary, which doesn't even follow the dates, because yesterday when I was writing my diary entry, I had day 1 and day 2, but technically they're the same day. But because I want to separate the thoughts, I just made them 2 separate days. That's why I don't even put the actual dates on top of them. I just say day 1, day 2, and just write it like that.
I actually also started writing a diary recently, but normally it's like after I've done some exercise, went out for a run or played some badminton, and after exercise you get all sweaty and you can't go to shower straight away, because if you go straight to shower, when you come out you're still sweaty. Yeah. So I just have to wait there to go to the shower, and I just type on my phone for like 10 minutes on any thought that comes over your mind. And it's actually very strange, because somehow after you've done some exercise, like you haven't used your brain for a while, like thoughts come over to you a lot easier. So I think that's really interesting.
And I think a lot of times we just realize how much of us we're living in the passive voice. I mean, a lot of times we like to think, oh, we're actively doing this, we're actively choosing things. But at the same time, just as strongly, or perhaps just as reasonably, we are also at the passive seat. We're laying back, we're relaxing, and then the thoughts come to us instead of us trying to look for the thoughts. It's like, and I was trying to analyze my dreams as well recently in the diary, and I've learned some
psychology.
Huh? Yes, I am becoming Sigmund Freud to some extent. Perhaps I wouldn't come to the same conclusions of the Oedipus complex, but I do think that analyzing your dreams might be is actually quite a profound thing to do, and you really help understand more about yourself.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I've been keeping a dream journal for like 6 months, and then when you go back to read those dreams, you're like, what kind of crazy stuff have you just have I just came up? Like once I was reading this Hemingway novel, I think A Farewell to Arms, and I didn't feel the novel was too good. It was about war and everything, and I found it was mediocre. But then like after I finished the novel, like 2 or 3 days afterwards, I had a dream about the novel, and I started crying like in the middle of the night after waking up from the dream. And then that's when I realized somehow that Hemingway had something in him. Because Hemingway had this iceberg principle where he talks about how your story should be like an iceberg, only show like the top 1% and then leave the 99% out. And whatever is left out, the reader can still feel, even though it's not read by him.
I think that's one of the things which is so amazing about Dostoevsky. It's like you have a 900-page book, and imagining that being the tip of the iceberg, I sometimes am afraid how difficult it must have been for someone like Dostoevsky to have so much information, so much thought in his brain, and it's like there seems to be a significant limit, a physical limit to how much you can express, but at the same time, the body seems at times a weak conduit to the amount of things that are in your brain, and that's something that I think is really the beauty of literature. And what was actually really funny recently, I was dreaming about something, and I realized that, and I wrote it down in my diary, and I was like thinking, okay, well, and recently I've been feeling that I've been descending into some sense of Nietzschean madness. I mean, I definitely didn't start hugging a horse and kissing it on the street, but at the same time, I have to admit that sometimes it does feel a bit like tiring and stressful, and I think it actually is between a relationship between our ideal and the practical. And I was talking with a friend about it in school the other day, and it was between about, well, how important is the pragmatic side of life when compared to the ideal side of life? And then when I was saying that, I was saying, well, you can't have the practical without the ideal, because all actions are based off of a fundamentally ideal structure. But at the same time, it's very difficult to have only being caught up in the ideals and not acting in the physical, which is perhaps one of the reasons for my apparent growing madness, perhaps, because I've been dealing for the past 1.5 years with the ideal philosophy, these abstract concepts, but not really caring about the concrete. So what would your thoughts be on that, perhaps about how the ideal and the abstract kind of interlink with your life and how you live out your life?
I think, first of all, it's very difficult to implement the ideal onto life. It's sort of it's one thing to know the concepts, to know the moral laws, to know Kant, to know the utilitarians, etc. But it's another thing to apply those rules onto one's own life. And I think there's definitely this gap between not what you believe, but what you know and what you actually do. And I think there's this Chinese philosopher. I'm not sure whether you know him. It's Wang Yangming. It's this kind of Ming Dynasty guy, and he talks about this concept of synthesizing what you know and what you do, and it's only when you do what you know that you, I guess, it's only when you do what you know that you really know something. I think it's a good segue into Jordan Peterson too, about the pragmatic and the ideal, in the sense that I think this is where I sort of disagree with Jordan Peterson for slightly, in that because he explains the Bible and a lot, or not lying and these kind of things in a biological manner, of how morality emerges from rats fighting each other, and how and the animals playing, in primates too, of how the highest I think monkey, the dominant monkey cannot be a tyrant, but is most of the time this kind of benevolent ruler. But at the same time, I think it's useful for you to connect the pragmatical value of these moral concepts. But at the same time, I feel like somehow, if you make the moral rules, such as do not lie, into this kind of, Siri just popped up. If you take these moral laws and then you just somehow, let's say you explain, do not lie. Let's say my sister asked me, why should he not lie? Instead of me telling her that because lying is bad, or lying is evil, I say to her, because not lying brings you the most utility. I think the second way of explaining somehow degrades this kind of moral law into a utilitarian principle, and in some sense makes it, I wouldn't say weaker, but makes it makes it, it demoralizes it.
Completely agree with that. Yeah, and I think it ties back to ultimately the, what do you call it, the is ought kind of question. It's the moment you reach science, the moment you reach like trying to use it for practicality, the only thing you have to ask is, well, why is that the rule? And ultimately you seem to have to undeniably end up in a very idealistic route, where you have some serious idealistic underpinnings where you really can base all your other ideas off of, and it's that kind of that idealistic underpinnings which are very important. And that was something I was thinking about Christ as well, like what is the role of Christ? And of course he is the Christ, he's a Messiah, but also it's Christ is the ideal. He's meant to be the archetype of the ideal. And because I think that the ideal is something, and I was thinking about it in my relationships with some people in my life, it's like there's an ideal, but it seems to be the very nature of the ideal by definition that you are meant to be separate from the ideal. You're meant to work towards the ideal, that's for sure. But at the same time, there's this sense of fear to be with the ideal. And because on one hand, you might be afraid, especially if this is a person, that you'll be afraid that if you joined with the ideal, you would ruin the ideal because you know that you're imperfect. That's one thing. And I think another fear at the same time is also the idea that if you reach the ideal, you're afraid that the ideal would not exactly be what you expected the ideal to be, if you got what I mean. Especially for imperfect ideals.
Yeah, I definitely agree with your 2 points, but I actually want to add a third point to it. It's somehow that not you're afraid to be with the ideal, not only because you're afraid that you somehow taint the ideal, and and somehow the ideal may not match up to how you do, but the ideal always judges you, and this is similar to what you talk about afraid that you're not good enough for the ideal, but the ideal sort of always stares at you, and it shines and somehow illuminates your deficiencies. And it's like because I play the piano, right? And there's some times where maybe there's some master classes where you can go to this very famous pianist and ask for advice and for them to coach you. But I've always been too afraid to go to any of these classes because I'm afraid to be judged by the master pianist regarding my piano skills, because you see it's very comforting for me to play piano in front of people who's not very good at piano, because somehow like no matter what, like even yeah, no matter how I play, like they'll think it's pretty good. But
no wonder you play the piano in front of me so much.
No, because like I can just play really fast things, and then somehow I know that it's deficient, the piece, but people who's not very great at piano can't really hear it. And I think it's the same thing for cello. It's like, I mean, when you're listening to your own piece, and when you're, let's say, I think an example would be when I'm trying to upload a piano video onto YouTube, compared to when I'm just ordinarily practicing. When I'm just ordinarily practicing, I feel like I'm playing pretty well. But then when I want to play a piece and upload it onto YouTube, I would play like 10 times and not get a single recording that satisfies me. Because it is in that way that you're sort of measuring yourself to the ideal, to your potential, to what you can really be.
I have to admit that that's perhaps a great prompt for me to apologize to all the viewers for why I have not actually released a video of me playing a song Once Upon a Time in the West. I've been promising you guys to play it because I've tried to record it. I have to admit, I was, honest to God, I was really trying really hard to record it, but none of them sounded as good as it was when I was practicing it, exactly like what Warren said. And that's why I haven't uploaded it. So it's got nothing to do with me not wanting to make the video for you guys. It's just because I genuinely just couldn't record one which is good enough. But I want to also build on that in the sense that I think the idea of the ideal judging you is something very interesting, because it goes to the Nietzschean idea of guilt and sin, right? Like to Nietzsche, guilt it's exactly what you say. It judges you. It ties you down. It makes you turn to some other obligation. You have to always keep on going towards another goal. And sometimes it's very easy to feel that you're imperfective and you're not good enough, and that that nothing you do would be good enough. And that's one of the problems, and that's one of the idea of the Nietzschean idea of self-desecration with guilt. But then at the same time, you could turn to the flip side of it and say, well, what actually happens if we get rid of the concept of sin, get rid of the concept of guilt? Is the freedom of man, or the complete freedom of man, a good enough justification to get rid of guilt? Because I sometimes like to think that guilt is a concept which is so important that it's absolutely impossible for us to physically get rid of without destroying our own mental edifice, if you got what I mean.
Yeah, I think related to this, I've been reading about Hannah Arendt on conscience. The word conscience is actually originally is the same word as consciousness. And consciousness, if you take out its roots, sorry, Siri came out again. If you take out the roots of consciousness, it is just talking with yourself. And somehow your conscience is this voice inside yourself that tells you to do something, that tells you what to do and what not to do. And Arendt's discussion on conscience would be that conscience is this thing where, because we're always, not always, but we're sometimes, at least when we're thinking, when we're conscious of ourselves, a 2-in-1 creature. So we have ourselves, and also when we're thinking, we talk with another part of ourselves. And the conscience is this kind of faculty that that tells us that we wouldn't want to live with, let's say, a murderer or a thief. And that's the part about why we shouldn't do bad, or why we shouldn't do evil. Because whenever we do evil, and more so when we're not punished for it, we're constantly dwelling with a thief, with a murderer, with a liar, and it's just not a good place to be, and it stops us from thinking.
I completely agree with that, and I think that, I think it's something that is very difficult, the idea of conscience, and perhaps it's also about knowing ourselves. It's that, and it turns to, I think, a fundamentally Christian idea, in the sense that we all have a knowledge of good and evil in our hearts, regardless of whether we like it or not. It's the idea that, or at least unless you're a psychopath, I mean, most people, if you kill someone, you know that's wrong. It's about that you're knowing your own flaws, which makes you understand and appreciate that you have to know the ideal, and it's that idea of conscience, which I think is very important. And in another sense, I think this ties into hatred, which would later turn into the slave morality, is the idea that what you hate about others is often what you see in yourself, if you got what I mean. And for the longest time, I really hated society because of a few different aspects, and I really hated it, and I didn't understand why I hated it, because normally I'm quite an emotionally neutral guy, if you know. But I mean, perhaps Warren knows seeing me most of my emotions before. I mean, I think the only time I've cried in the last 2 or 3 years was right next to Warren. But I mean, I have to say that I'm normally quite an emotionally neutral guy. I don't feel too much emotions, but there was some strange reason for why I hated society so much, or at least disliked it to the same degree as I do right now. And I think I realized that one of perhaps the reasons of that disagreement, or a reason of that kind of hate, is because I saw some part of the aspect in myself, and that's what I really disliked. It's about that idea that you aren't good enough, and you could do better. You have a standard for yourself which you're just not reaching, and that's something that I perhaps see in society and I see in myself, and that's one of the reasons perhaps why I feel that, and that's something I think we should keep in mind, if you got what I mean.
And also my dad always tells this to me. It's like when we make fun of other people, we make fun of each other a lot inside the family, and especially my mom. And when we make fun of her, there's this strange phenomenon where if what we say is what she's actually deficient in, then she will get very angry. But when we say something, when we criticize, or when we just make fun of her for something that she knows that she's not actually that bad at, then she doesn't get mad, and she's quite nice about it. Sorry, Siri pops out again. And I think related to hatred too, there's also envy, which is quite similar. And I think envy compared to hatred would be what you see in yourself, and envy would be what you see in other people that you should have, but you shouldn't develop. But you have not developed yourself yet. Yeah.
I think envy is definitely...
I'll just turn off Siri whilst you talk.
Sure. I mean, maybe we've actually said something about Siri which was true, and now she's very annoyed. But I think that perhaps, envy is something which is very quickly tied into resentment, and in the idea that what we look for in other people is that I think we are all fundamentally very egotistical people. And I know there's that Chinese proverb, 人之养鸡戳行婚喜. It's like the idea that everyone's good at birth. And I know Warren knows Mandarin more than Canto, so probably there might have been a linguistic
I know what you said. Said.
It's the idea that they're in the Chinese tradition, it's a lot of the idea that man was born good but went bad. Whereas in the West, it's more of man was born bad and went good. And I fundamentally like to think that man was born bad and can have the potential to good, because I think the first one is perhaps a too naive view of reality. And perhaps the reason for that is because, and perhaps one of the reasons for envy, and I don't think envy is completely bad, because envy tells us what we need to improve in a lot of situations. Not all the time, but at least in a lot of situations. For example, you might be envious of someone who's richer than you. I'm not saying that money is everything, but seeing someone richer than you, you want to work towards that. It gives you a goal as long as you use that emotion correctly. And And that's the unfortunate thing. And that's what leads to state morality, is when people see that envy, see that resentment, and take it in the wrong way. Instead of trying to improve yourself, you then make it a problem of the person opposite you, if you get what I mean. And I think that's perhaps where Nietzsche comes on the state morality. And that's something that I've been thinking about recently.
So are you, I guess you're kind of distinguishing between two different kinds of envy. There's a kind of envy that's tilted towards resentment, which is the kind of envy where you aim to destroy your ideal, so you're not judged at all. But that kind of envy is really destructive. And if I'm not wrong, I think that's probably why Dante put the envious person down in the very, very depths of hell. And there's also another kind of envy where it's sort of you realize, you become conscious that you envy about the person, and then after you becoming conscious of that person, you turn this envy into something not necessarily. You use this envy to diagnose something about yourself and try to improve yourself and match up to the person, so you don't feel envious. And yeah, I think envy is a very, very annoying emotion.
Yes.
A very aggravating one, because I still feel envy for some people. I think it's like when I see some people like they've graduated uni at like 18 years old, or like this math prodigy who managed to, I think, who managed to get like the IMO gold medal when he's like 16 or 15, and then I do feel envious. And I think I feel envious first because I'm not as good as them, and I feel like and then they're sort of, I'm sort of being judged when I see what potential human beings have. And at the same time, it's the kind of emotion that even if you're very introspective and you realize that you're envious, it still bites you. You know, it still hurts.
Definitely, yeah. And I think it's like the idea of emotion, the dual-sided nature of emotion. It's like, well, sometimes the emotion is good and sometimes the emotion is bad. It's like how you soon realize that most of your weaknesses are actually, or can be, twisted into strengths, if you got what I mean. Like a very arrogant person's arrogance can be easily twisted to confidence and might save him a very big deal. Perhaps I was quite an arrogant person in the past, but now I've twisted that into confidence. But now that I'm saying that I've changed my weaknesses to strength, I now sound quite like an arrogant person myself. So I mean, I think I found myself in a bit of a Russell's paradox or something like by saying that you're not arrogant, you become arrogant, and I don't know.
Yeah, this is also related to what I've been reading today on Arendt. She talks about, I think there's this quote from the Bible where, like, when you do good, you cannot let the right hand know the left hand. Do you know that quote? Yeah. So doing the person who does good cannot let other people know that he's doing good, or else the nature of the motive of you doing good has changed, and what you do is not good anymore. So and somehow when you're doing good, you cannot even let yourself know that you're doing good, or else the motive has changed and you're not being good anymore. So the person who's doing good is the most lonely person in this sense, because his goodness he cannot even let himself know that he's doing good. And if it's not for, I guess, God witnessing the goodness that one's doing, then this kind of goodness would be complete isolation. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think I agree with that. And I think that sometimes, and I think that's why man needs an ideal so much, even though that ideal is so destructive at the same time, or can be so destructive. It's like you need the ideal because even though you're not doing good for yourself, or not to let yourself know, you're doing that good to reach out towards the ideal. And at least in that sense, there is some sense of goal. There is that Christ that you're moving towards, because without that hope, without that goal, then that reasoning to do good without having an exterior motive to it, it becomes way more difficult without that goal. And that's something I was thinking about. It's like the myth of Sisyphus. And Perhaps, I mean, whenever I say that, it goes directly to Camus, but perhaps in the more traditional sense or the analogical sense, it's like, well, man without God, what I like to see is like Sisyphus, it goes around and around and around. Man creates his own ideas, creates his own values, and hence is just caught in this trap of thinking he's not good enough, but by creating his own values, he becomes good enough, but then he dislikes the values that he's created and gets caught in a trap. What Christ does, perhaps, and what the ideal does, is making that cyclical nature of life kind of a linear one. It's the sense of man now has something to move towards, and he's no longer moving in a cycle, but upwards towards a certain ideal, which I think is perhaps one of the only escapes or one of the only solutions to the problem that we're faced with in a lot of situations, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of interesting points there. I think the first thing I have to pick out is I've been thinking about this idea of how you're supposed to strive towards the ideal, and I think related to the goodness paradox, and also similar to the goodness paradox, there's also what I've discovered called the paradox of love, in the sense that when you love, you cannot know that you're loving, and you cannot even try to love, because once you try to love, or once you know that you're loving, you cannot be loving anymore. So
well, that's perhaps why we all failed at relationships, mate.
Okay. No. I took this from David Foster Wallace. Yeah. But I do fail at relationships too, undeniably. Maybe because I've been thinking too much about these kind of things, and now I'm actually not loving, but actually just thinking about whether I am loving or whether I'm not loving, whether my love is authentic or inauthentic, and then getting bogged down into these kind of stuff. But anyways, so so related to these two paradoxes, I feel like the way that you should strive towards ideal is somehow embodying the ideal and making the ideal yours, instead of actually explicating and actually stating out the ideal, in the sense that and that relates to our previous discussion about literature, in the sense that it is literature that really touches us, and instead of the kind of syllogistic arguments that one makes perhaps in some form of philosophy, in analytic philosophy, there's in stories a miraculous power of letting us of welcoming the ideal to embody us, if just to relate to our idea of the thought coming to us, not us going to the thoughts. And also the Sisyphus one is very interesting too. I've been working on another idea that somehow Sisyphus is still blessed, in that he still has the power to push, or he still has the motivation to push the rock up the hill. And the worst thing that can happen to oneself is not suffering or pain, but a kind of complete indifference towards the world, of not feeling anything. But I'm still thinking about whether pain and suffering is worse than not feeling at all, or is it the other way around, that constant pain is worse than not feeling? Because I think I've talked to you about this before. I actually feel like hell is better than death sometimes, because in hell you're still living, and although you're suffering, you're still living. Whereas in death, in the kind of atheistic death, it's just complete nothingness. You don't feel anything. And I'm just wondering what you think about it. But I feel like I may be a bit naive here, because I haven't actually experienced real suffering. For example, recently I've started running long distance, and I think I may want to alter my view a bit after the suffering from each running session.
Well, I think I could first comment on your point about love, and then we can talk a bit about love and death, suffering and death again. I think I completely agree with that. I think love, as its first principle, as being love first, has to be irrational. And how do we know that? I think is because if you look at the story of Christ, God's love is very irrational. I mean, if anything in the entire Bible is just seen as the height of irrationality, would be the idea of God coming to die for us on the cross. Like, why on earth, at least in human terms, would the perfect being want to die for sinful beings? Like, if you could think about human suffering, that's bad, but imagine a perfect being having to suffer the same as a human. It's like a king having to starve himself on purpose for someone who hates him. Like, that is, at its ultimate core, I think, is the nature of love. It's an irrational feeling which you have very little control over, and the more you think about it, the more you lose it. And that's why love has to be lived and not thought too much about, I think. And that's why the love for your neighbor is so difficult, or because we're thinking too much, we're adding too much implications about it. Like, why is it so difficult to hate the person who hates, or to love the person who hates you? It's because you're thinking about the fact that they might backstab you. But if you're accepting it first as a starting point, if you're accepting love as your starting point to all your worldview, then it goes the opposite way. It's no longer rational. It's based off an irrational basis, not in the irrational basis in the sense of it being negative, but in the sense of it being just acceptance, if you got what I mean. I think that's the nature of love. Mm-hmm.
So love is almost this kind of miraculous faculty, in the sense that it does not follow reason, but transcends it in some sense, and is able to, I guess, transcend the boundaries of reason and make life, I guess, sparkle.
I definitely think so. Yeah, I think love is that it's the emotion which makes you feel that there's so much more to life than the physical world. I mean, like, I have to admit myself, like, in my past, like, I had a relationship before with like someone, and and I have to admit that that like I would not have appreciated life as much without that, and that's why I'm eternally grateful for it. And I'm not going to, and I know I'm saying it like I'll never have a relationship again in the future, but no, but it's like, and I should jinx myself too early because who knows what's going to happen. But I mean, I have to say that it's that idea of love. It's like, it makes you understand that there's so much more to the universe than physicality and reason. Because thinking about what I've perhaps gone through in that relationship, like, it's like, well, why did I even bother staying in it? Or perhaps if I stepped into the shoes of my ex, like, it was like, why the hell would I stay with it? And it's like, there's an irrational aspect to it, and it helps you understand that love cannot be rational, but not in a bad way, but in a good way. And it's the idea that there is something which goes beyond the physical world that we experience. It's the idea of brotherhood. It's the idea of acceptance and forgiveness, which is so beautiful. It's kind of how Mushkin, I think, and it explains how Mushkin, even though Rogojin kills Nastasia and almost kills him, still kind of forgives him and loves him till the very end, and when he falls into insanity. He embraces Rogojin on the floor. It's like, well, why would you do that? It's because love goes beyond that, and there's something transcendent in life which is born within our hearts. And perhaps that's why the Chinese said that Yanzi Cho is Singbunsi. It's like, people start off good, because I do think that there is good in people's hearts. It's just we have to look towards finding it, if you got what I mean.
Yeah. And I would say that you're right. Somehow we have irrational desires, and our life cannot be completely rational, or a completely rational life is a life that's somehow not worth living. If you live your life without any without committing, I guess, any faults or any acts of passion, like Dostoevsky in the casino, then you're somehow starving yourself of a part of life, even though that part may be perilous at the time, from the view of the present. Somehow it is these acts that transgress reason that has to be appreciated in life, that makes life transcending. I've been using transcendence a lot today.
Perhaps it's like the same in my use of the word profound, which I seem to say in every sentence. But I do completely agree with you. It's like, you have to have that suffering, that bitterness, and that ties on to your point about suffering and death. It's that you need to have that suffering, you need to have that pain in order to appreciate the beauty of it. And perhaps like Stavrohin in Demons, it's like he's suffering with nihilism. You have Stavrohin and Stepanovich, right? You have you have the one who fulfills his nihilism, or actually not his nihilism, but his depravity with killing other people. And then you have Stavrohin, who just tries to fill that gap in his heart by just doing anything. He sleeps with people. He does all that things to try to fill that gap in. And it's completely irrational, but in the same way, it seems to be that he's trying to fill that gap in his soul, which cannot be filled by reason. He's the most reasonable person in the book, perhaps, but there is a massive gap there which has to be filled with something else. And I had a dream recently about it as well. Like, someone asked me out, and I wrote it in my diary, but and I said yes, but not because necessarily I wanted a relationship per se. And that was the weirdest thing. And I was thinking about it afterwards. I was writing in my diary, and I was like, well, why would that happen? I think it's because humans need to go beyond the ideal. We live in the ideal so long, we have to go beyond it. And that's perhaps what the dream was trying to tell me. It's like the messy side of humanity is scary. It cannot be controlled. You don't have complete control over it. You cannot calculate it. But it's that lack of control, lack of calculation, that is the paradox, I think, of human existence. We want that as much as we want the ideal. And it's about balancing it, which I think is the first principle of humanity. And that's why we know that nihilism is such a big threat, in my opinion, if you got what I mean.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And it's the kind of leap of faith that you have to take to go out into the world without knowing what it consists, or to commit yourself to something without knowing whether you will succeed, but still doing so wholeheartedly. And I think this relates to, I think, this wonderful Kafka story. I just can't resist telling you about it. I think it somehow relates to this. It's about this person who just, I think it's two people who just searches frantically in the room, and then frantically in the room, and then like searches for the door to go into another room. Or it's kind of, I guess it's a metaphor for salvation or some way out, right? And they're searching for the door, and they search for, I think, hours on end, days, and at the end they find the door, and then they realize they push the door, right? And the door is the way out, not the way in. They've been in the room all along. So it's in this kind of constant struggle for meaning, constant struggle to make sense of the world, that sense actually lies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's the idea of, it's kind of like heaven and hell is within you. Like the choice, like the mind in itself can make a hell out of heaven and a heaven out of hell. I mean, whenever I try to say that quote, I always turn back to the Zarathustra contra Alyosha. Oh, quick reminder for you, I might be publishing that soon, but I mean, like I think that is so true. It's like, and that's the beauty of free will, at least in the Christian sense. It's like God has given us the choice of whether to go to heaven or hell. And a lot of people like to say, like, that's not our choice. Or it's like, why didn't God give us more evidence? And I'm thinking, well, yeah, maybe more evidence would have been fine, but it's like the lack of evidence has never stopped people from coming to God, if you got what I mean. And I'm not saying there isn't any evidence, but I mean, you don't need a demonstrative empirical evidence of God existing. I mean, there's like how many billion theists in the world right now? It's astronomical. And it's idea that, well, we have the choice, and well, what exactly do we choose? And I guess it's the idea that, and you say hell is perhaps better than death. It's like, and I would agree with that, because like, after all, why should we be afraid of death if God doesn't exist, if you got what I mean? It's the idea of, and it's something that I don't know. It's like, it's very easy to say that let's not be afraid of death, and especially in an atheistic sense, right? God doesn't exist, and what is death? It's absolutely nothing. But at the same time, it's that it is absolutely nothing. Those few words, which is so frightening to you, if you got what I mean. It's that. Yeah. It's the idea that the fact that it is absolutely nothing scares you, not in a philosophical sense, but just because the idea of man losing his meaning and man losing his values and his intrinsic thoughts and experience, like you say, it's just a very frightening thought, if you got what I mean.
Yeah, and I've been recently writing this fiction piece for a competition, and in it there's this I used death as this metaphor for complete indifference, Like that, you know, there's sometimes when you become sort of in the depths of despair, you become. It's almost like you do not want to do anything. There's no heaven or hell. There's no ideal to strive for or nothing to fail. It's this kind of complete indifference in life where it's very hard for words to describe. It's sort of like when you become so guilty or filled with so much remorse, so much kind of energy that suddenly you cross this kind of threshold, and then on the other side it is just nothing. You stay there and you almost don't feel. And when you come out of that sort of feeling, and then you look back at it, it's the scariest thing of all, just not feeling anything. Because in the fiction piece, my argument is sort of not necessarily argument, but I said something like, in hell at least there's a heaven that you can look at, or a heaven that you can think about, even though you'll never be able to be there. But in complete indifference, heaven and hell disappear.
I definitely think so, and perhaps that just leads you to a question of whether it's just better to just accept heaven before that, and perhaps that goes to Pascal's wager, though I don't necessarily think you should enter that relationship with God because of wanting to go to heaven, because I don't think that's why you should believe in God, and I would rather have someone just choose to go to hell, or go to hell, but rather than choose to go to heaven just to choose to go to heaven, if you get what I mean. It's that relationship with God which is the most important thing. And perhaps that death which you're talking about and that fear is our shared fear of nihilism, which I think is ultimately, in my opinion, the biggest challenge of my life, or of modern society. And that's what I was writing in my aphorisms the other day. It was, man is on the verge of nihilism. That is the starting point of all humanities. That was my aphorism that I wrote the other day.
My aphorism, my favorite one, is something like, we nevertheless try to sleep in a world that is not made for it. Yes. It's like there was this. I was just lying on my bed and I just couldn't sleep because I think I was reading too much Kafka, and then these thoughts just kept on coming up to me, like these aphorisms. And then every time an aphorism comes over, I like frantically reaches out to my phone to record it. And after I record it, I cannot sleep anymore. And I want to talk about I also want to talk about your thoughts about whether, because you talked about how it's easy for us to say that we should not fear death, but in reality it's very difficult to implement, or very difficult to really accept. What do you think? Do you fear death, or are you afraid, or do you think you? Yeah,
I have to admit that, and it goes against what I've just said, but I do think I don't fear death too much, perhaps. And it depends on how you die as well, right? It's like, because recently it's also in my dreams as well. I die a lot in my dreams for some reason. Most of those deaths are for sacrifices. It's like I'm either sacrificing my life for a person or an ideal, or some time that I'm sacrificing my life. And it's one of those things which I think it ties back to Christianity. It's like, Paul says something, to live is Christ and to die is gain. And what I think he means by that is that death for Christians is a way to salvation. It is the ending of your journey in life. And it's kind of like, it's like the end of a journey, and you know that you've reached a certain destination. And I don't fear death in the sense that because I'm afraid of the opposite. And what I'm afraid of is perhaps it's because living out the ideal of Christ is difficult in my life. I don't think it's too difficult that I would rather ditch the ideal and ditch Christ, because I do think that Christ, in some sense, like sin, the falling short of the ideal has a burden, but the burden of not having the ideal is even more significant than failing the ideal every day, if you get what I mean. And perhaps death is perhaps the idea, like, if you can't live by the ideal in a perfect way, at least perhaps the easiest way of it is to die by your ideals. And that's what I was thinking as well. It's like I was thinking about the sacrifices in the dreams, and I'm like, well, if that happened in real life, what would I be most afraid of? Would it be the decision of sacrifice? I don't think it would be. I think what I'm afraid of most is the idea that that opportunity would arise and I'll be too afraid to go through with it, just as I failed to live up to the ideals before as well, if you got what I mean. And in that sense, I kind of embrace death, and it's perhaps not the most enlightening thought to think of, but I think that is a solution to the fear of death in some sense.
It's almost like if the situation comes and you don't sacrifice yourself, then I think related to what we said before, you can't live with yourself, and then that's even somehow more sufferable than dying. And I think there's also a very interesting psychological thing, because in my dream, instead of me dying, I keep on having other people dying. And I have other people dying, and I wake up crying that they have died. Like, I remember, I think just last week, I dreamt of Heidegger visiting China, and then Heidegger visiting China, and I served as this kind of translator, right? And then this doesn't correspond to historical fact, but in my dream, Heidegger had like this late stage skin cancer, and then I was taking Heidegger around China, and at the end we went into like this hotel, and there were like two other women, like middle-aged, like kind women, and then we were just chatting, and then I just looked at Heidegger with a kind of waning, and then not having a lot of life, and then still remaining serene in front of death, despite his condition, and I just started crying and came out of the dream. And some of my other dreams are similar to that. Like someone is dying, someone I love is dying. Instead of I've never found, I don't think I've ever had a dream of myself dying. I mean, maybe there's some significant psychological truth there, maybe, or psychological difference.
I definitely think that's the case, perhaps, and you know, it's something that's, I think it's like a thing you have to find out for yourself, but. Mm-hmm. I definitely think that the idea of someone else dying is perhaps it's the idea perhaps of a representation of the world around you falling apart in some sense, if you got what I mean. And the idea that that the people that and perhaps in my sense, it's the idea that I'm trying to work towards an ideal which I'm failing, and perhaps in your sense, it's the idea that you're also are working around to an ideal you're failing, but instead of perhaps it's like what I was saying, like that's Zarathustra one. It's like you're climbing up the mountain, and perhaps I'm trying to climb up it. But and the other one is that the mountain stays the same, but everything else is crumbling down. And perhaps that might be something to think about, if you got what I mean. And perhaps that goes to might be our last topic that we want to discuss. Is just our views on Christianity and our interactions with it. Because a lot of my views on Christianity have changed a lot, and I know that your views on Christianity have changed a lot as well. And could perhaps discuss our different problems of Christianity and kind of discuss that a bit as well here, if you got what I mean.
Yeah, sure. Should I start?
Sure,
I'll start then. I think I first, when I was in like year 7 or year 8, like very young, right? And then because our school has PRS, philosophy and religious studies, and I remember very clearly once I was sort of walking back home, and then people were asking each other what subjects they're choosing for year 9. For people who don't know, for the British system, in year 9 we have to choose our GCSEs, which is kind of this first exam that we have to take before the A level, which is the AP in American system. And choosing for GCSEs, I could have chosen religious studies, and people were discussing what GCSEs they wanted to choose. And then I was like, why I wouldn't want to choose PRS, philosophy and religious studies, because so much of it is Christianity, and I don't believe in Christianity, etc. and etc. But my views have actually changed a lot, and it's part of being friends with Josh, and also another part is listening to Jordan Peterson's lecture. Although I don't completely agree with anything, like a lot of things that he says, but he explains the Bible in such a way that and he makes a very compelling case that there's some deep and profound truth in the Bible. Although I would say that when he links the Bible to utility, there's a kind of a leveling down of the Bible with the utility and losing of this divine significance. But nevertheless, when Jordan Peterson explained the Bible in a kind of scientific rationalist way that I was accustomed to before, like when I just started reading philosophy, it changed a lot of my views on Christianity. And also just seeing how, interacting with you, seeing Jordan Peterson, just seeing how people can, and also reading people like Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, to see how this kind of belief system, this sort of leap of faith beyond the scientific, beyond what we certainly know, is something that, although I myself may not be able to do, is at least something that is very commendable. And relating to perhaps I myself not being able to accept Christianity or completely believing in it, in the sense that I've been thinking about the writers that the writers that I've read, and I've read a lot of Dostoevsky, partly because of Josh's recommendation, and also I chose it for a school project. I had to write a really long article on Dostoevsky. So I read most of his major works, including this I think 1,000-page biography on him. But and I feel like somehow I didn't manage to retain a lot from Dostoevsky, even though I managed to appreciate him. But I somehow didn't manage to take as much from him as I've liked to take from him. And this is, I think it's related to a kind of cultural background and my upbringing. Heidegger had this idea, which is that we ourselves, he called us Dasein, but that's not related to the entire topic. Heidegger has too much jargon. But anyway, so he said that we always have an understanding of being, an understanding of ourselves, and this understanding of being manifests itself in our cultural practices, in our social interactions. For example, in how far away we stand with each other when we're talking to each other, or what kind of gestures we make. Do we nod when other people's talking to signify that we're listening? How in the lift do we look at each other in the lift, or do we sort of move our eyes aside to avoid eye contact frantically when we're with someone who we don't know in the lift? And all these things form our own understanding of ourselves, and none of these are conscious. And his idea is that somehow we don't have a complete freedom of choosing our identity and choosing who we be, because a lot of it is given to us. He says we're thrown into the world. We don't choose to be to the world. We're just thrown into whatever. And his idea of the world isn't necessarily the universe, as in all the atoms and molecules that moves around, but the human world, the world of cultural practices. And it is from our cultural practices and that we can take out what identity we wish to assume, even though we're not completely defined by one identity from birth. We can only choose to assume one that is presented to us, that we're thrown into the world that we're thrown into. Anyway, this is a very long-winded way to say that culture has a big effect on your belief.
I'll agree with that. I'll agree with you in that, and perhaps a bit about my faith is that, and I don't think mine's as perhaps as interesting as your one. I mean, when I was growing up, I always grew up in a Christian family, but I don't think I purposely really wanted to be a Christian. Right? I don't think I ever lived up a good Christian life until perhaps after a significant change of events, and that's perhaps even after I got baptized, I didn't become a really good Christian after that. It was after some more self-reflection. I wouldn't consider myself a good Christian now because I do agree with Nietzsche that there was only one Christian, and I mean you could switch that a bit and I think more precisely say there was only one good Christian and he died on the cross. I think that's true in the sense that like no one else can become Christ. It's like no one's a good Christian, but we're all just
and
kind of
didn't
working towards
even
that.
I think didn't even Christ say something like even he himself is not good, and the person who's absolutely good is God who's in heaven.
Yeah. Mhm.
I think
Yeah, and
that's cool.
yeah, that's true, and it's the idea that I think in my faith it was really like a change in my life, which really helped me. Helped me really turn towards more philosophy and stuff like that. And I know when I started this channel, I was always focused on the existence of God, like apologetics and stuff. But now I think my channel has gone to something which is like less so focused on apologetics. And to be honest, to a certain degree, I'm less worried about whether God exists, more worried about whether we need God in our lives. And I think that the need for Christianity is just so evident and so strong that like even if God exists, I'll find myself doesn't exist. I mean, I would find myself with difficulty separating myself from that structure. And perhaps responding to your point is about what do you call it? About the cultural representing your beliefs. And I do think there's a significant cultural implications on what you believe in. But at the same time, I'd like to think that we have a choice to go beyond our culture, if you get what I mean. We can't let our culture define us. I mean, the culture has built up on our past, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's perhaps a sufficient reason to not believe, if you get what I mean, in the sense that saying your culture determines you, I think, might just be akin to saying that how science determines morality, or you get morality from science. I think there's a similar gap there between the culture influencing our choices and our responsibility for our choices, if you get what I mean. I think there's a gap there as well.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points to talk about here. The first point is that Heidegger, when he talks about culture conditioning our choices, he's somehow saying that the culture presents us with all the possibilities, and we can choose amongst those possibilities. But also, I myself also had doubt about his I guess representation of culture as a thing that we can never get out of. He says we can never get behind our thrownness, or get behind our culture, behind our world. And because I was thinking how the first, just related to you, how the first Chinese ever became Christian, you see? Because it's definitely, I think somehow you can adopt or you can immerse yourself inside another culture in some sense, and immerse yourself in such a degree, maybe by reading literature, maybe by interacting with other people, or maybe even after those having some significant event inside your life, and then somehow being integrated into that culture, or having a kind of understanding of yourself that incorporates another culture other than your own, and maybe that's possible. And also the third point, this is related to Heidegger. He has this idea of a reciprocal rejoinder. This reciprocal rejoinder is, even though he doesn't want to put any moral value on any of his ideas, but reciprocal rejoinder is probably the closest he gets from putting a moral value on things. And he thinks, I would say that he thinks it's good. But so he says, even though we're thrown into the world and then we have this culture around us, we can somehow get into our culture, and this is our way of living most authentically, would be not to really immerse ourselves in our culture and to discover its possibilities, and somehow from those possibilities and come back and give back something to the culture. And this is his account of how to change, how cultural change comes about. The example would be someone like Martin Luther King, who takes the Christian precepts, the Christian idea from American culture, and then changes the culture, and finds this kind of contradiction in the culture, and then changes the culture in such a way that what is against the Christian idea of equality before God is at the end rectified.
And I would think that perhaps, as just a brief response to that, is that I do agree with you that most of our choices would be given by our culture, our upbringings, right? But at the same time, perhaps in a sense of a Nietzschean way, in the same way that Nietzsche tells us to go beyond good and evil, perhaps that we should go beyond the culture. Because I mean, I don't think that we should see culture as a significant limiting factor to our beliefs. And I'll just like to perhaps invite you to perhaps go beyond the culture in a sense that it's like, well, not only are we talking about this fundamental nature, which is, yes, it's definitely like I have great Chinese influence on my life, and you perhaps have more Chinese influence on your life, being closer to the Chinese tradition than I do. But at the same time, I do think that it is difficult to go beyond our culture, but at the same time, I think it's definitely possible, and maybe it's not out of a rational way, perhaps in some sense, like love, in the same way that you overcome the restrictions of your culture. I mean, yes, there might be a rational way out of it, but I think there's also a spiritual and a psychological element, or well, I don't want to say a rational escape, but perhaps a leap of faith out of the confines of the society and the structure you live in, to go beyond that, and perhaps that is a solution to that problem, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult issue of whether your culture really determines your entire range of possibilities, or whether you can get beyond the culture. And I think I would want to clarify a bit that there's maybe a difference between society and culture, in the sense that society is this thing which it really assigns you one belief, and it limits the possibilities presented to you in culture into this one dominant narrative, as we like to say right now, and Heidegger calls that the day, or the one, depending on which translator you choose. So somehow you yourself in ordinary life is a part of the one, and the one is this, I guess, this unity of all, like all the cultural, all the societal beliefs, and the mainstream beliefs, or the main trends, the dominant, I guess, the fad at the time, the things that is imposed upon you from the culture, and which it's very hard for you to escape. And somehow it is yourself who is also contributing to this one. And the scary thing about the one, in Heidegger's view, is that when you follow the opinions that's assigned to you by your society, by the one, then there's no responsibility left. There's no one behind the one, because if you say one does that, one does that, one does this, there's no person behind it. It's just this big mass of irresponsibility, if you get what I mean.
Yeah,
in contrast with the culture. And I think I don't really want to argue about whether we can get out of our culture, because that's just I think too difficult of a thing to debate right now. But Heidegger would say that somehow the culture presents us with possibilities that goes beyond what beliefs society assigns us with, and we somehow have to go into the depths of culture. And maybe that's why we need to read the history of philosophy, or read a lot of literature, not only contemporary literature, but also literature that comes from a long time before. Why we should study the canonical texts. Why we should read the Bible again and again, perhaps compared to maybe reading one after another of an interpretation of the Bible by someone else, since interpretation is always doing violence to the actual text. And I think also related to your previous point about you talking about how your channel's dealing with, I guess, whether God is really necessary, and also you've been posting a lot of content on Nietzsche recently, and I think it's somehow a very admirable thing to do, because for one to wrestle with a thinker and take seriously a thinker who disagrees vehemently with your own belief is something that we can all learn a bit from. That no matter whether you completely agrees with someone else's critique, or whether you believe that you have an answer to it, by acquainting yourself with someone with another viewpoint, and by wrestling with it, you can somehow come out with a more profound understanding of what you believe and why you believe it than before.
And that's one thing I was thinking about recently as well. It's like, I've always felt that I perhaps emphasized or like related more to Nietzsche than Dostoevsky in some weird sense. Perhaps because one thing, I think Nietzsche was misrepresented a lot, and I think a lot of my channel is to try to do Nietzsche justice, or at least present the most reasonable interpretation of him. And of course, interpretations don't do the writer justice, but at least try to spread awareness about how he shouldn't be as often misrepresented as he is. And partially because I feel for him. I think Nietzsche's right in 90% of the things, like his ideas on the slave morality, his ideas about the twisted and the fallen nature of the church. I mean, apart from his ideas about guilt and sin, which I think are directly wrong, I think most of his critiques are correct, but just aimed at a different version of the church and something that I don't hold into, if you got what I mean. And that's something I want to share. And perhaps in some sense, I felt that perhaps discovering Dostoevsky was Nietzsche's last chance of being saved in some sense. It's what could have saved him from his ultimate insanity. And perhaps reading Dostoevsky could have saved him. He just didn't choose to live it out as well, if you know what I mean. And that's something that I was thinking about Nietzsche recently. And I mean, I guess we could end this stream off on the fact that if you have anything more to say, please go ahead. But I mean, I guess we could end it off on a slight discussion about our favorite books, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to start, or?
Sure, yeah. I think my favorite book is, I mean, I've gone on a few people's streams, and when I say it's not the Bible, they're like, wait, what? But I mean, I have to know my favorite book, perhaps. I have to say it's The Idiot. I think it's by Dostoevsky. I think that's definitely a fascinating thing, if you know what I mean. It just goes to show, I think, everything that is good in Dostoevsky. It talks about the problem of nihilism. It brings forth that. It brings forth the need of Christ. I think the beauty of Christ as well. And the idea that you might be a Christian, and by being a Christian, you might get hated by the world. And that's definitely a case. It might be misunderstood. But you have to keep on fighting. You have to keep on loving and forgiving, like Mushkin. And that's something that you want to work towards. It's that ideal, which I think is developed beautifully in The Idiot. How about you?
Okay. I think I have a lot of favorite books. I think I'll take this chance to also convince you. I may have to list quite a lot more books than one, but I'll take this chance also to convince you to maybe read some of these books. So maybe I'll separate them from novels and philosophy books. In terms of novels, I think the first novel that really made me start to write fiction, but I've written a bit beforehand, is David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. I think I have ranted a lot. I've talked a lot to you about this book. It's incredibly thick. I think it's 1.5 times the words of the brothers. So it's definitely it definitely takes a long time to dig through. But what David Foster Wallace was trying to present there is this kind of profound loneliness that comes out of America's society, no matter what. I don't want to use the word consumerism or capitalism, but a kind of inability to relate to other people, and inability to love, to experience the divine sometimes. Because actually David Foster Wallace also really likes Dostoevsky. I think there's a kind of common thread throughout all of my favorite writers. They all read Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky is one of the writers that I like too. And Yeah. One of them is Infinite Jest. It's a huge volume. I think you really have to commit yourself to reading it. Maybe at least take like maybe 1 hour a day to try to slowly grind through the volume. It would take around, I guess, 40 hours. But just because of its pure size, it's really fun to read. Until the start is really fun. It's a bit of a slog in the middle and a slog at the end. But it's really it really
So it's
changes
kind of
you in
like
some
running a
way.
marathon then.
Yeah, it's running a marathon. Okay, it's suffering throughout, but after you come out of the marathon, the marathon changes you in some way. Another book recently, another novel would be Kafka. Kafka's The Trial, much shorter than Infinite Jest. And Kafka's The Trial, I think it's almost profoundly Christian, or it has some profound Christian or at least Jewish ideas that is incorporated in the modern world. I won't want to spill too much from the novel, but the trial is about this person called Joseph K, who in this society with this very strange trial system where in the trial they don't tell you why you're guilty. They sentence you. It's a very, very long bureaucratic system. No one knows what's going on. Even the person trialing you don't know what you're guilty for. And then he at the start he doesn't take seriously the trial, and then at the end and then slowly he realizes the seriousness of the whole thing, and it is this sudden ending where I won't spoil it, but it's like all of Kafka's novels. It's unfinished, but somehow I think it being unfinished adds a flavor of mysteriousness to the entire thing that makes it even better. Even though I'm not sure whether Kafka would have improved the whole thing if he could have finished it. And another one, I think Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, definitely, and people who watch your channel probably already know about it. And I guess these three are my favorite fiction. And in terms of philosophy, Nietzsche definitely, the things I've talked about, but something new. I've been talking about Arendt and Heidegger a lot in this session. And for people who's brave enough, I recommend you to tackle Heidegger's Being and Time. It is very difficult to read, I have to say, like incredibly difficult, but I think it took me twice as long as reading Infinite Jest to finish Being and Time. I spent like 4 hours every day for like an entire month to actually getting the whole volume finished. But it's extremely rewarding if you're willing to put in the work, because Heidegger is envisaging this kind of profound reworking of Western metaphysics to eliminate the subject-object dualism of Descartes into he calls it being in the world. So and what being in the world is, you can only find it out from reading Being and Time, and it's very profound. The very interesting thing with Heidegger's book is that he not only gives you ontology, but he was influenced by Kierkegaard. So he also gives you a kind of, I wouldn't want to use the word existentialist, but a proto-existentialist, much more profound than Sartre, I think, ethics or kind of non-ethics that you can use. Another one would be Hannah Arendt's, I think it would be 2 volumes, but paired together. One is called The Human Condition, and another is called The Life of the Mind. The Life of the Mind she didn't finish because she had a heart attack after finishing, I guess, 2/3 of the thing. So The Human Condition and The Life of the Mind are sort of companion volumes, and they're examining 2 sides of human life. The Human Condition examines the human life of action. She distinguishes between 3 types of action. No, not action. The human life of act. It's the vita activa. Okay, she uses the Latin phrase vita activa, and in the vita activa are action, labor, and work. These three huge things where most of the vita activa, the active life, subsumes under. And then she has the life of the mind, which talks about the vita contemplativa, which is the mental life, the life of the mind. There she separates out three different faculties: thinking, judging, and willing.
I think his Wi-Fi.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So which part did I cut out?
After you said the vita activa for I don't know which time, but yeah, just I think it's all right.
Okay. The human condition talks about the vita activa, and then there's the life of the mind, which is about the vita contemplativa, which is the life of the mind in Latin, and she talks about judging, willing, and thinking. These three main faculties of the mind. And she just analyzes it. And what I really love about Arendt is she writes in a very lucid way.
Okay, he's just completely disconnected now. He's just gone. He's just gone now.
Unfortunately, I don't think my Wi-Fi likes Hannah Arendt.
Yes.
Anyway, okay, I'll do the last attempt at introducing Hannah Arendt. Okay. Hannah Arendt writes in this very lucid way. I think she's different to Heidegger in this regard, although I guess it's just gossip. But Arendt and Heidegger had a love affair in like the 1910s, in the 1920s, because Arendt was a student of Heidegger's. And then they started having this love affair, even though Heidegger already had wife and children. And Arendt decided to break the relationship because she wanted to devote herself to philosophy. And she felt like Heidegger was wasting too much of her time. But this aside, okay? Hannah Arendt writes very well, even though she writes in long sentences, very long sentences, because her native language is German. And then she switched to writing English at when she's like 30 years old, after running out of Germany from Hitler, and then coming over to America, emigrating, etc. And also, what I love about Hannah Arendt is that she gives you very, very fresh perspectives on all kinds of thinkers, from Kierkegaard to Marx to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And she explains especially Aristotle and Plato, because before I don't really think I don't really like their work. So I find it quite boring, especially Aristotle. he's sort of just categorizing and not doing anything with it. But Hannah Arendt renders him very readable in a very great way. And also she has a sort of, I guess, a lot of Christian heritage behind her. She's very well versed in Saint Augustine. Her doctoral thesis is on Saint Augustine, and he also uses Duns Scotus a lot. And she's very well versed on Kant. This is an unbelievable part of her biography, and I guess this is one of the things that's aroused my jealousy. She started reading Kant when she was 14. Okay, she started reading the Critique of Pure Reason when she was 14, just casually reading Kant from her father's library. And yeah, and if you're interested in Hannah Arendt, there's a very good interview on YouTube. Just search Hannah Arendt interview. I think it's from their person, and then you can just find it. It's very good.
If you're interested in Hannah Arendt, Kafka, and Heidegger, make sure you go check out Thinker's Kitchen, which is Oren's YouTube channel.
Yes, please.
You can check it out and hit the like and subscribe button, as I've said. I hope you've enjoyed this stream. We've talked a lot about the state of morality, Jordan B. Peterson. We've talked also about how our views of Christianity have changed and thought and all these interesting, cool stuff. And also these will also be coming out on my podcast called Dostoevsky and Us. So if you guys want to check out my Dostoevsky stuff, or you're out and about and just can't have time to watch his videos, just go check out Dostoevsky and Us. It will really help you out. And also go check out Warren's channel. Like always, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Absolutely anytime, just let me know and I'll happily have you on the channel. So everyone, God bless. Like always, stay safe and goodbye. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.